Hello, and welcome to our virtual broadcast of Managing a Site-Wide Emergency Power Shutdown, presented by David Von Dam. David is a divisional director at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. David is a certified FEMA incident commander with over 8 years experience in the emergency management field and 21 years of experience in security, operations, and program management. If you have questions during this session, use the chat tool at the right, type in your questions, and I will relay these to David if we have time for a Q&A at the end of this session. Please join me in welcoming David Von Dam to the virtual stage.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for being here for a presentation from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. My name is David Von Dam, and I'm the Division Director for Security and Emergency Services here at Berkeley Lab. And today we're going to talk about the public safety power shutdowns that occurred in Berkeley, California, and the Bay Area, the Greater Bay Area, in October of 2019. We're going to talk about how that relates to emergency management, lab resiliency as a whole, and then most importantly, some of the success factors that led us to a successful operation, and then also some lessons learned. And the goal here is for everyone watching to take away a nugget or two to make their lab a more resilient lab. So I hope I'm able to accomplish that in this presentation. So we had two events, public safety power shutdown events. And let me talk just for a minute about what that means. Yeah, in California, as many of you know, just from watching the news, fire hazards are really a large threat for us. And as a national laboratory, obviously we're very concerned about that. And we're also in a high-risk area, being against a hillside with quite a few eucalyptus trees and other fire hazards. The Pacific PG&E is the public utility which manages power in this region of California, and they've instituted a measure where they will actually shut down power to power lines during high heat and high wind conditions to prevent fires. And many of you have seen on the news some of the fires in Sonoma, Paradise, and other places of California that have really devastated whole large parts of towns and other geographical regions of the state. So we are subject to those power outages. We had two events. So for the agenda today, I'm going to talk about the two events we had in October for shutdown. And then for the second part of the agenda, I'll be talking about the impacts at Berkeley Lab. And then of course the lessons learned and some notes on resilience. So just a quick timeline, these power shutdowns, these planned power shutdowns that I spoke about earlier are a new thing. This is not something that the lab has faced before. It's not something California's faced before in terms of utilities shutting power off proactively. And our first notification that this was even an obstacle for us was May of last year. May of 2019. So what we did was we immediately formed a power outage working group to plan for these power interruptions. Those membership on a group like that is obviously key. Members from operations and research and emergency management coming together and talking about what do we need to do to prepare, what do we need to do during an outage, and then what's the best way to get the lab back up and running. To a certain extent, you're never going to be able to tabletop all the different scenarios you're going to be faced with. But again, hopefully you'll get some nuggets from this and you can do some things that we weren't able to do ahead of time. In October, PG&E moved us from a watch and warning status to imminent power loss status. Our first public safety power shutdown was October 8th through 14. And the next one followed that just about a week later. I have a slide with some more detail on that. But before I get into the detail on the actual, some particulars about that shutoff, I want to show you a quick video that we produced that kind of gives you the flavor of the mood of the team, some of the obstacles that we were faced with, and then some kind of commentary from staff who were part of the incident. So I'm going to go ahead and press play right now.
Initially, it was just what is happening. You know, it was some anticipation about when is the power going to go off, as well as coordinating to make sure that we shut down everything safely and ask people to evacuate the lab. And then when the power did come back on, then the heightened activity and excitement of watching buildings come back online, the HVAC being turned on. Yesterday was a lot. I guess I'm proud to be a member of the EOC because I think this is a very important role to make sure that the research can continue as it should be.
All of our heads are starting to get a little fuzzy, right? Okay, we've been working long hours. We've been concentrating on the lab. We've been concentrating on being safe. We've been concentrating on our incident objectives, okay? But it's also Saturday. At the beginning of the week, none of us thought we'd be here on a Saturday. So I'm just bringing this up for situational awareness, and that safety is the number one thing that we're focused on today.
This emergency event did stress our systems, our processes, and our people. But I'm happy to say that we responded as one laboratory, as a team, a cross-functional team of facilities, of operations, of business, and the science organizations to prepare for this response and then to begin to reactivate the laboratory in a systematic fashion.
Once PG&E got the power to us and we got the power to the buildings, that's really just the beginning of the process, because it's not like just turning things back on and having people come back to work. All these systems that keep people safe at the laboratory, everything from HVAC to fume hoods, everything needs to be working up to the level that when people do come back here, everything is safe. So that's why we needed people from every part of the operations and safety life support for the laboratory. All had to be here to make sure building by building that it was ready to occupy again. So that's what's been going on, and that's why it took 2 days to go through that.
It's this collaboration between all of these various functions is what one team looks like. I'm particularly proud of the fact that we did this work safely and we did not have any injuries, exposures, or accidents during the event. And we have been working around the clock since Tuesday, and that is a significant event. So at this point, I'm happy to declare that we are fully operational and we did this as a team, and I couldn't be more proud of the men and women of our laboratory for working together as colleagues in the best interests of this institution so we can resume our important programmatic science mission.
Okay, so I hope everyone enjoyed that video. You'll notice our Chief Operating Officer, Michael Brandt, and our lab director, Mike Witherall, on that video. A lot of members of the Emergency Operations Center, and so one of the things that's great about these events is that they bring people together, and you get to work with people in a way that you weren't necessarily able to work with them in other times. So there's always a silver lining here. Okay, so back to the presentation here. So this slide that you see here entitled Public Safety Power Shutdowns is a snapshot of both events. You'll notice that by the time we got notice on the first event number 1, October 8th through 14, it took us about 2.5 days to power the lab down, to get it ready for shutdown. In a power outage, you can't just, we have critical research equipment. Not all of that research equipment is on backup power. So part of our pre-planning was identifying what equipment had to be on backup power and getting it rerouted. It meant anything from plugging a piece of equipment into a different outlet and running extension cords, to setting up temporary generators, you name it. But all sorts of work of that nature was done during the prep period. Also, you can't forget user facilities, notifying users, notifying employees. A lot of work. There's, I would say, just as much work in the pre-power outage as there is in the restart. In the first event, we were down for 18 hours, And then it took us 47 hours to get the lab back to resume operation state. You'll notice that in the second event, we learned we got better at it. So it was a much shorter power down period and a much shorter restart period before resuming operations. Going to the next slide here. Okay, so this is a power impacts outage impact slide here. So we were very fortunate, no injuries. We had about for each of the events, our responders as part of the emergency operations. We had, of course, our emergency response organization, which filled our EOC, but then we had responders in the field, electricians, safety professionals, HVAC, obviously our electricians that were in the field doing the good work. We also had a number of researchers on site because they had the specific subject matter expertise with specific research equipment. So about 120 people in all. By the way, the population of our lab, we have close to 10,000 badge employees and affiliates. But at any one given time, it's really closer to about 5,000 people on site in any one given day. So just to give you a sense of how many responders we needed for our site, it's a 200-acre site, and we have 90 populated buildings and a number more buildings that aren't populated. But yeah, about 120 first responders there, or responders, I should say. I'm sorry. Yes. And then if you include the extended staff, it's really closer to 300. So I'm sorry, we had 120 operations and then 300 total for total number of people involved. A lot more science, people from science than you would expect. But again, a lot of very specific and critical research equipment that needed specific attention for people to come on site. I would say, building related work orders. So you can count on, after you go through a power outage event, you can count on a significant number of work orders, because what's going to happen is a power outage is going to tell you where all your failing equipment is, electrical switches that don't come back online, surge suppression equipment that needs to be replaced, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. HVAC, blowers that don't restart, you name it, you will be faced with it. And then you'll go back to your preventive maintenance record and say, yep, that was on the list, but we just hadn't got to it yet. So that's a plug for a good, solid preventive maintenance program around your site. We used over 10,000 gallons of diesel fuel for the generators that we have on site. And by the way, our generation capacity does not cover obviously 100% of what we need to run the lab full bore. So next slide here, entitled Success Factors and Lessons Learned. So advanced planning obviously is key. You need to identify the critical systems that need backup power. You know, if refrigeration units with 10, 20 years of research results in them, obviously you need backup power for that. There are things that don't necessarily need backup power. Microscopic equipment and other things, some need it, some don't. So really working with the research areas and identifying what that critical equipment is going to set you up for success later on. So your emergency response organization obviously is critical here, but for an event like this, you need to identify people who need to be as part of that organization who traditionally may not be. Specifically, what we did was we pulled in senior operations folks that are in the research area. They actually work in the research area, but they work within operations within the research area, not within operations at the lab. And we couldn't have done it without them, because they provided that critical research reach back when we needed quick answers on a particular building or a particular issue that we're faced with in our facilities. Understanding the dependencies for a safe and stable shutdown. So when you're shutting down equipment, a lot of times researchers need help, but when you call the electricians over, they may be working on another piece of equipment. So understanding what the dependencies are and coordinating the ballet, so to speak, in a way that is harmonious and maximizes your time up versus your time down. Obviously, user facilities have special needs. So I would recommend specific targeted meetings with them to really understand their needs, and then also negotiate. They're going to be pushing to have power up at the very last second, because as we all know, our user facilities are valuable. We have people that schedule to come to them years, months, and years in advance. And so the longer we can keep them up, the better, to not interrupt the science. And obviously, the communication is a key part of that with our research partners and user facilities. So, my next slide here: emergency response organization, EOC. I already talked about the first bullet on the mission support officers. Those are those research individuals who we supplemented the EOC with. So probably one of our biggest obstacles was accountability. Uh, we had a quite extensive list of people who were tapped on the shoulder to be part of this response event, and the list during the actual event only grew. So site access, knowing who's authorized to be on site during the shutdown, having a mechanism to track those people, validate that they need to be there, first of all, and then account for them on site for their safety is huge. That's an area that is an improvement area for us. We ended up using an iPad solution and a Google Sheet so that we could populate names real time, and our security officers at the gates had an iPad and they could see names populate and let people on site who were validated. You can also use your access control system, but I just want to warn you that in a time of emergency, you can spend all the time in the world figuring out who the emergency essential personnel that need to be on site, and it's going to change. There's going to be somebody that needs to be on site that you didn't anticipate for a certain piece of equipment, and so you just got to be able to adjust for that and have mechanisms mechanisms for those scenarios. EOC space. We had some challenges there. We actually ended up moving our EOC. Fortunately, on site, we have two fairly good EOC spaces. We're working on an offsite location right now. COVID is a big deal. Fortunately, first of all, we were not faced with that. Fortunately, we were not faced with that last October. But guess what? We're heading into another power outage season here in 2020, and that's probably like one of the number one things we're tackling is how to manage an EOC when you need to social distance. Strategic communication. So another lessons learned, you cannot communicate too much. They're just as important as everything else. You can be doing the best job in the world, but if you're not keeping your stakeholders informed, certainly the Department of Energy, but your community, the lab leadership, you can be doing the best job in the world, but but the perception will be otherwise. So we had strategic communications embedded in everything we did. We had several reports and conference that went out daily. We had a daily conference call with all the division directors, both research and operations, every day to update them on what was happening and bring up any issues we were facing. Again, you can't communicate too much when it comes to events such as this. Safety obviously has to be the number one priority, because if you can do the best job in the world, but if someone gets hurt, it's all for nothing. We actually had a safety stand down as part of our first of the two PSPS events. We had a scenario where we had a responder. I say responder, but it was actually one of our team members who was on the safety team, and she was embedded with some HVAC and electricians, and they were going through making our each space ready for rehabilitation or reoccupation, excuse me. And there was some miscommunication, and she entered into a research space with some harmful chemicals that the vent hood had not been re-energized yet. And so she could have been faced with an exposure incident. Fortunately, she wasn't. She came back to the EOC. We got her on the phone with our field. We have a field physician on staff. She turned out okay, but we ended up doing a safety stand down because there was a communication breakdown. We ended up having a team enter into a space that wasn't safe, and so we reevaluated our processes from square one, and we continued, and we had no more incidents. Having a methodical energization plan. So you'll see that graph here on the right, the Excel graph in the picture. We had key items that need to be accomplished for each building before a building could go 100% green, and we meticulously tracked that each was done. And again, in one particular case for the safety stand down, it wasn't tracked appropriately. There's a miscommunication, so that this is where we restacked our process. But making sure that the building is ready for occupancy obviously is just as important as the pre-power shutdown preparations. So this is one of my last slides here on laboratory resilience. I'll say that resilience. The definition of resilience is an individual or organization's ability to come back to normal quickly and effectively. And so when you look at the concept of resilience, there's a few things that we're doing presently in that regard. Upgrading our vulnerable electric HVAC and building control systems. I mentioned before, there were some modernization products that we had or projects that we had on tap before this event, and it highlighted the fact that you can't, when it comes to modernization and preventive maintenance, it's an investment that's well worth it, because if you're faced with a situation like this and you don't, and modernization and PM is not happening, you're going to be that much worse off on the back end, right? Plan for extended operations without power. So in previous planning, under no scenario did we ever see this coming, that we would actually be under a scenario where there would be a power outage that was planned, where the whole lab would be out for an extended period of time. So right now we're looking at long-term solutions to include cogen power plants and some other solutions that will hopefully get us where we need to be. We're actually partnering with PG&E right now. We have a microgrid on the lab with 6 major switch stations. One of those switch stations coming into this next power outage season is going to have an uninterrupted power supply, a diesel-based uninterrupted power supply for that switch that's part of our microgrid. So we're partnering with our local utility on that pilot project, and if it's successful, we'll look to fund it so that we can replicate that at our other 5 switch stations throughout the site. I talked about the critical nature of identifying buildings requiring and systems and facilities requiring backup power. I can't stress that enough. Let's talk about vegetation and tree clearing. So we have a goat program here at Berkeley Lab. We actually have goats that during the summer that eat the short grasses that grow around the site. We do regular vegetation clearance and tree clearing to include the roads up and around the lab, and that has paid huge dividends for us. We actually had a live fire on site 3 weeks ago, and it spread incredibly slowly. It was a grass fire from, we think it's from a 4th of July stray firework, but it was on site. Our fire department responded, but because of our vegetation clearance, it was very slow moving, and it really saved us. So can't stress the importance of vegetation clearing enough. Creating diverse power systems, including localized power alternatives. I talked about the pilot for the uninterrupted power with PG&E and the cogen plant. The cogen is a large generator that could ostensibly handle the entire load of the lab. And so obviously an alternative like that is pretty expensive and long-term, but it's something that we're looking at as a laboratory. So this is my last slide. Thank you for sitting through the presentation. I hope you got something from it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you for your presentation, David. I would like to begin our Q&A. We have a question from David Stuhan. He asked you, how did you manage keeping some sensitive experiments from being negatively impacted by the power outage, and how did you prioritize?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that. Thanks for the question on that. So the first thing is, you can't do this without partnership with the research areas. And that needs to be something that happens soon. So pre-planning is incredibly key. The first step in that pre-planning is defining what those critical systems are. So for example, freezers that hold research they can go back decades, results of various types of research, freezers, microscopic equipment, you name it. The first step is to develop a definition for what your critical equipment and critical systems are. I'll offer a couple definitions for you. Number one, if the critical system or critical equipment loses power and you lose research, that's one. That's an obvious one. Number two, if that critical system or critical piece of equipment loses power, and then it is thereby damaged, because some equipment needs constant power. So those are two very important criteria. And then your lab may come up with some other criteria. But once you've figured out what your criteria is for your critical systems and equipment, then you identify it. And then you work with the research areas on each research area having a specific plan for that piece of equipment to make sure that when the power goes out, that it is 100% on backup power. And it's going to be different depending on the building. I'm sure at your labs, you have buildings anywhere from 80 years old to 2 years old. So some of the buildings may be on backup power, some may not. Some may have certain outlets that only certain outlets in that building can have backup power. Other outlets are not on backup power. So all of those details need to be worked out ahead of time with those critical pieces of equipment. And then finally, it's the actions. So your operations divisions at your labs will be stretched incredibly thin, trying to service all the requests for assistance. That is why each research area needs to identify essential personnel that are subject matter experts in these pieces of equipment, or they're the ones responsible for them, that get recalled and are at the lab within a short period of time to be able to put those systems make sure those systems are hooked up appropriately before the outage occurs. And it's got to be a partnership, and the research areas have to be involved, because the operations just does not have enough people to be a part of that. So each research area needs a specific plan for their area. So that's how we handled it here at Berkeley.
Thank you so much. This was such an important presentation, and I'm already getting lots of comments, David. Well done. Great lessons learned. And I'm sorry to cut this off, but we have reached the end of this session. If there's questions that we didn't get to, David Von Dam's email is in the speaker list on Attendify, or I'll be happy to get it to him. You can send it to me. And if you could complete the survey by clicking on the survey icon just below the description in the virtual meeting app in order to receive credit for this. And our next session will be maintaining a healthy CERT program. You can select it from the schedule on the left, or you're always welcome to join another channel to watch an SBX demonstration, attend a workshop, or participate in any user groups. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.